Have you ever had a seemingly ordinary event, a seemingly incidental event that turned into something major in your life? Maybe, every day when you get up, you don't expect some life-changing event to happen, but sometimes you do something almost ordinary or seemingly insignificant, and a major change comes as a result of that. Our lives are kind of like a pile of marbles, maybe a pile of marbles in a plate, and they're stacked up in there, and sometimes you can move a marble and nothing happens. Sometimes you move a marble and 3 or 4 of those marbles shift. But every once in a while, you can move a marble off that plate and everything rearranges. That whole pile just shifts into something completely different. And our lives are kind of like that. There are times when events in our lives seem like ordinary events, but suddenly we realize they're changing everything in our lives. I've had a few of those in my life. Maybe you have too. And if you've had that, have you ever come to a place where you looked back and you said, even though all that shifting was uncomfortable, those marbles shifted for a purpose? Maybe you realize because of that, God put you in a specific place at a specific time. You were right where you needed to be because of some ordinary event that happened. 20 years ago, I was pastoring in Alamosa, Colorado, and I went to visit a man in our community who had attended our church a few times and was starting a business there in Alamosa. And he came quite a while for a couple months and then kind of disappeared, and I went to visit him. And he shared something with me about his observation of our church in Alamosa. And it was just an ordinary visit, kind of a simple thing that he shared. But that little marble moving over the next few months completely shifted my life, completely shuffled everything in my life. And I'll be sharing possibly more of that story next week. God puts people in the places he wants them. He shuffles the marbles in their lives to accomplish the work that he wants to accomplish. You remember a little boy who took his lunch to see the famous rabbi, and God used that lunch to feed thousands of people. Maybe you remember a young man to go out and look for his father's lost donkeys, seemingly ordinary event. He came back anointed the king of his nation. Maybe you remember a boy carrying a care package to his brothers on the front line of a battle. He ended up winning one of the biggest battles in that nation's history single-handedly. You see, sometimes God takes ordinary events and he shuffles the marbles in our lives. And there is a wonderful story in the Old Testament that illustrates that event in an amazing way. We want to look at that book over the next 6 weeks. It's really an unusual book. It's unusual as a Bible book. One commentator said, this reads more like something in Reader's Digest than in the Bible. Do you know God is never mentioned once in this book? Maybe some of you didn't know there was a book in the Old Testament that never mentioned God at all. There's no mention of prayer. There's no mention of providence. It seems like an impossible fairy tale. And yet, in this book, God is behind every little detail that happens. It seems like an impossible fairy tale, but with God, nothing is impossible. And God is behind every little detail of this book. And we're going to see that as we work through it. This book is called Esther. It's in your Old Testaments. I've mentioned before, I think it's the most exciting plot in the Bible. Of all the stories in the Bible, this one has the most exciting plot with all kinds of twists and turns, as we'll see as we go through it over these next 6 weeks. It's called the Book of Esther. I want you to turn there. You open to Psalms and turn left to a book called Proverbs and to a book called Job. And right before that book is this small book of Esther. We're going to spend 6 weeks in it. I think I said in the little video that we made to announce it on Facebook and online that it was 5 weeks. This week I was putting my notes together and I said, this looks like about 3 sermons. And so I split it into 2 and added a week. And so we're actually going to be doing 6 weeks in this series, not 5 that I had said originally. And that makes us end on Thanksgiving week, which is the perfect week for the final sermon of this series anyway. And so that's where this is going. Before we go into this book, I want to set the historical background to help you see where in history this falls. And so I put up a timeline there. There it is. And I'm going to step down here so I can see it as well and talk to you about some of the things that are on it. Hopefully people at home can see that. They won't see where I'm pointing, but they can read it. And just to give you some key dates in the history of Israel in biblical history, way back in the 900 BCs, before this chart comes into play, the nation of Israel divided into two nations. The northern nation of Israel, which included 10 of the tribes, and the southern nation of Israel, which included Judah and Simeon and some Levites and some people from the tribe of Benjamin, became a different country. And so we had the countries of Israel and Judah. The country of Israel, the northern country, was conquered in 722 by the Assyrians. And they took a lot of those people into exile. They forced them into intermarriages, and those tribes were pretty much lost to history because of that. The southern kingdom of Judah remained a kingdom for another 140 so years. In that interim period, Babylon became the world power. The Babylonian Empire conquered the Assyrians. They became the world power. And they came and attacked the nation of Judah a number of different times. And when they did that, they oftentimes took captives with them. And so what you see on this chart, what the green lines are the prophets that were prophesying during that period. The gray things down here are the rulers who ruled over the area of Judah. And they're all from different countries, depending on what's happening. Josiah, one of the last great kings of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, the first real king of the Babylonian Empire. His father sort of was, but he's kind of known as the first one. And then the rest of these guys are kings of the Persian Empire. But when Babylon came into Judah and conquered them, 3 different times they came into the nation, and each time they took a number of captives with them. You can see those on those charts. One of those was in 605, the first deportation. One of those, the second one, 597, and the third one was in 586. That's the year that Babylon came in and utterly destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They knocked down the temple, they knocked down the palace, they completely leveled the city, basically, and completely destroyed it. And that was in 586, a real key date of biblical history. It's on the chart right there. And so a number of these captives were taken. Now in the middle one, the second deportation, the king, young king of Judah, Josiah's grandson, Jehoiachin, and some of the Bible books call him, I think, Jeconiah, but Jehoiachin is his most common name. He was taken to Babylon as a captive and spent a number of years there. Another person who was taken captive that year is the famous prophet named Ezekiel. And you can read his book and his story in the Old Testament. There was another man from the tribe of Benjamin named Kish, and he was taken captive in that. We'll come back to him in just a moment. The Babylonian Empire didn't last long. In 538, 539, Persia conquered Babylon. And Cyrus became the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire, a huge empire over the world that lasted for centuries. And he was the first king of the really big Persian Empire. And Cyrus wrote an edict that people that had been taken from their homes captive by the Babylonians could return home if they chose to do so. And a lot of Jewish people returned to the nation of Judah. They were under Persian rule, but they were able to go back to their homes. But a number of them stayed. Some in Babylon, some had moved to Persia, as we will see in just a minute. And they were having prosperous lives there, so they just chose to stay, not to go back to Jerusalem and to the area of Judah. And they remained there for a number of years. And we know a number of names of people who did that. Some of those are on this chart. The return of Ezra is in that era, as is the return of Nehemiah. And you can read their stories in their books with their names. But just before that happened, the book of Esther comes into play. Cyrus had a grandson named Xerxes. That's what he's known as on the pages of history. He ruled for 21 years over the Persian Empire. His Hebrew name was Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. And that's the word that often shows up in the Bibles. Some of your Bibles will say Ahasuerus. Some will put in his more common historical name, Xerxes. And so you might see either one as we're reading. I'm reading the English Standard Version. It has the Hebrew name Ahasuerus, but you can know who he is on history by that name, Xerxes. And so that's who we're talking about here. And so with all of that historical background, that's where the book of Esther comes in. And we want to look at the first 2 chapters of this book today. It's a play that plays out in 3 acts. And so just for fun, I put curtains on our background. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We put curtains on our background, and that's what we'll be doing just for a little bit of fun with these slides the next couple of weeks. And so we want to begin this book by looking at Act 1, Scene 1. And Act 1, Scene 1 is a king-size party. It's the 3rd year of Ahasuerus, of Xerxes, and he decides to put on a humongous party. Now, there's probably a couple of reasons for this that we can see from history. One, it took him a couple of years to really establish himself as the king of the entire empire. And so it took a couple of years to get that established. We also know that his dad, Darius, did a lot of conquering of the world. He was never able to conquer Greece. And that was kind of one of the things he wanted to do. And so Ahasuerus took on himself to go and try to conquer Greece. It's something the Persian Empire never accomplished, but Ahasuerus was going to do that. And he was probably planning that campaign about now. And even though this book doesn't tell us that, history says he brought in a lot of his officials to meet and talk about a campaign to Greece. And so this big king-size party served 2 purposes: to talk about the campaign in Greece with all of his officials and generals, and to show off his wealth. The first thing we see about this king-size party is there was a no-cash bar. The last 7 days of this big event, the king let people drink whatever they wanted to drink. Just go and get it and drink it. And as you might imagine, sometimes those kind of events turn into a drunken bash. And that plays into, I think, what happens in this story. I'm going to read to you bits and pieces of these first 2 chapters. They're way too long to read it all. But I'm going to read through the first few verses and pick and choose a few phrases to help you see what's going on in this party. Esther, beginning in 1:1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and his servants. He showed them the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. 180 days, it says. And when these days were completed, the king gave a feast lasting for 7 days. And it tells what sort of wealth he was showing off. And then in verse 7 it says, drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And it goes on to say everybody was able to drink what he wanted to drink. That's what was happening the last 7 days. Sounds like a crazy feast to go on for 7 days, doesn't it? And that's just a picture of what he was doing to show off his wealth. That was the whole intent. I want to show off everything. It was lavish. Listen to bits and pieces of verse 6 in that chapter. There were white cotton curtains with violet hangings. What are the royal colors? White and purple. Blues and purples are very hard to find natural dyes for. And so the people that could do that, we sold them to royalty. Royalty color was purple. And here there are hangings of white cotton and violet and fine linen with purple, with silver rods, with marble pillars, couches of gold and silver, and a mosaic pavement of porphyry and marble and mother of pearl and precious stones. I mean, this is, interestingly enough, exactly what we find in the palaces in Persia that we're able to uncover. And this description is exactly the kinds of things we find in the historians of the day, exactly what was going on in the temple or in the palace in Susa. And so we know this is real consistent with the other history we have. And this king was showing off all of this incredible beauty, everything that he had. And he decided there was one other thing he wanted to show off. He had a trophy bride. and he was going to show her off. And that opens up Act 1, Scene 2. Let me read to you. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, keep that in mind, he commanded a number of eunuchs who served in his presence to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Okay, he had a trophy bride. He was going to show her off. And Act 1, Scene 2 is a queen-size rebellion. He sent for her, and she said, no, I am not going to do that. It's interesting how I read occasionally that some Christian people point to her as a villain because she wasn't in subjection to her husband, and she wasn't being submissive to her husband. I'll tell you right away, women, I don't agree with that at all. Because what's happening in this story is not anything to do with biblical submission. It has everything to do with sexual exploitation. You see, she was told to show up in her crown. That probably meant only her crown. And the whole intent was to parade her in front of a bunch of drunken men. That was the whole purpose of this king. And it's no wonder that she said no. I don't blame her for that at all. In fact, I think she was wise to do so. But anyway, lost my place. It made the king angry. Ultimate authority and anger and wine don't mix very well. And it didn't in this case. In fact, it says in verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, and the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. And that opens up then Act 1, Scene 3, because the king calls together his cabinet, and he asks them, what are we going to do about this situation? Now, when you read this, remember what's happening. All of these men are a part of the party. They're all drunk, okay? Keep that in mind. And they make a decision as a cabinet when they're drunk. He calls them together, and this is what the king says. The king said to the wise men who knew the times, it lists some of them and so on. Verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti? Because she has not performed the command of the king. What are we going to do with her? Is there a law about this? And these men stuck their heads together, and they came up with two solutions. The first one is this. They recommended to dispose her as queen. Get rid of her. Listen to these words. One of the men spoke up and he says, it's not only against the king that Queen Vashti has done this wrong, it's also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of the king, for the queen's behavior will be known to all the women. Get rid of her. Here's the reason why. This word's going to get out that she disobeyed her husband. And guess what? All the women are going to start disobeying their husbands. And think about these guys standing around and they're going, yeah, my wife's just like that. That's what she's going to do. And so they came up with this really radical idea. And they wrote an edict that's down a little bit later. I think it's down in about verse 22, where they sent out an edict to the entire kingdom that women had to obey their husbands, regardless of what they were asking. And in addition to that, it said that Queen Vashti would never again come into the presence of the king. If it pleased the king, verse 19, let a royal order go out from him that Vashti is to never again come before King Ahasuerus. So he banished this woman from him. But they made a second suggestion as well. Give her royal position to someone else. Not just someone else, but listen to the words. Queen Vashti should never come before the king, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. To another who is better than she. And they put together a plan of how to do this. One of my favorite all-time movies is Chariots of Fire. It's a real old movie. It came out in the early 1980s, so maybe some of you have never seen it. It actually was a Best Picture Academy Award winner in 82 or 83, somewhere in there. And it's one of my all-time favorite movies. It depicts two runners from England in the 1924 Olympics in Paris. And these two runners have two completely different motives to run. One of them is a Jewish man who has felt the persecution of Jews all his life, and he's running to prove he's somebody. The other, Eric Liddell, is a man who he says he's running for the glory of God. He's running for the glory of God. And these two motives are played against each other in this movie. And there's a fascinating scene where Harold Abrams is running at Oxford University. He accomplishes a running feat that hadn't been accomplished in centuries. There was a distance they had to run around a courtyard in a certain amount of time. It hadn't been done in centuries, and he did it. And what you see in that movie scene is up above the courtyard in a window, the president of the university and one of his colleagues are there watching, and they turn around and they say, "There's probably not a faster man in the whole kingdom." But before they even say that, the scene cuts to some green hills in Scotland. And you hear them saying that as you're seeing the green hills in Scotland, and what we meet is the one man in the kingdom who is faster. And it's an amazing scene change, and that's exactly what the author of Esther has done. Because right at this point, when he sets this scene, we're going to find someone far better than her. The scene suddenly changes. And in chapter 2, it says, there was a Jew in Susa. Very quick scene change. There was a Jew in Susa, and we meet the person who is better than she. We open up to Act 2. That introduces us not only to this Jew living in Susa, but to his cousin, who is an incredibly beautiful woman. Her name is Hadassah. That's her Jewish name. Her Persian name is Esther. Esther has two possible roots, and probably both are intended in that. It comes from, just like it almost looks in English, a star, from the Persian word for a star. And it also comes from the Persian goddess Ishtar, and those were related. That's why I said it's probably the same idea. Ishtar was equivalent to Venus, the goddess of beauty and love. And so this is this woman's Persian name. She's the goddess of beauty and love. Here's what we know about her. She was a Jew living in exile. Her great-grandfather was Kish, that I had mentioned, who was taken into exile from the tribe of Benjamin in 597. He was carried off then, and so he was a Jew. Keep that in mind. It doesn't come into play the next couple of weeks, but later on it's very important to the story. So keep that in mind. Both Mordecai and Esther are Jews. She's an orphan. She was raised by her older cousin Mordecai. We learned that in this passage. And so keep in mind that she had seen some difficult times in her life. We don't know anything about her parents other than their names. We don't know why they passed away, what happened, but they did. And so she was raised by her older cousin. Listen to the words. Chapter 2, verse 5. There was a Jew living in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. He was a descendant of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. So there we're introduced to our heroine, a Jew, an orphan. But the very next phrase says she was very beautiful. Very beautiful. Listen, this is typical Hebrew understatement, okay? Listen to what the author says. The woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. You want some words? Voluptuous. A ravaging beauty. Okay, guys, you don't get those big words. Let me put it in your plain, simple language. She was smoking hot, okay? That's what the author is trying to tell us. That's the woman that we're talking about. But her beauty wasn't just physical beauty. She had a delightful personality. The kind of personality that you might describe as winsome. It's something that lit her up from the inside so that her physical beauty was even more so. because she had some sort of inner winsome beauty. It says in chapter 2, verse 15, she won favor with everyone that met her. She won favor with everyone who saw her. So not only a very beautiful, hot woman, but a woman who just is a delightful personality. And so we have Act 1 setting the stage in history. Act 2, we meet this woman of great beauty. And then Act 3, there's an incredibly big, grand beauty pageant. Now, if you read the text carefully, you'll find out this is 4 years later. 4 years later, and you go, what happened in the interim? Because the advisor said, get rid of Vashti, have a beauty pageant to bring in another. Well, history tells us that's exactly when King Ahasuerus went to Greece and was in Greece over 2 years for a military campaign. He was defeated horribly. It was utterly embarrassing. And he comes back home, and it's that point when he realizes he's missing his Queen of Beauty, and it's time to replace her. And so he was out for over 2 years of this interim period. And when he comes back, that's when they decide to have this grand beauty pageant. And this makes Miss America pale in comparison. Actually, this is how my daughter described it. She said it's more like the Bachelor Persia edition than it is just a beauty pageant, because there's all these eligible women applying for their, trying to get the attention of one man. And I've never watched that show other than little clips here and there, but that's exactly what this sounds like. I wonder if this was the inspiration for that. I don't know. I'm sure some of these women were just clamoring for the opportunity. Oh, I get to be in the palace. I get to live with the king. I get to be the queen. And I just wonder if they were clamoring for that opportunity. I think they probably were. They were going to do anything they could to win this contest. And as you know, some women can be very petty and competitive. Now, careful, it's none of you, I know that. But women can be. And I'm sure that was the setting here, that these women were pretty competitive with each other. And it was going to be a battle because the prize was so big. Interestingly enough, in the midst of that, Esther quickly becomes the favorite of everybody. If they had a Miss Congeniality vote in this beauty contest, she would have won it because she's everyone's favorite. And she becomes the favorite of the eunuch who is overlooking the ladies and taking care of them. She becomes his favorite right away, and he's giving her some special things because of that. And she becomes the favorite of even of some of the other women, interestingly enough. And again, it's in that context where it says she won the favor of everyone who saw her. And so she became the favorite right away. And that brings up Act 3, Scene 2, the real Cinderella. Or somebody said the real Annie, orphan who becomes wealthy. The real rags to riches story. The fairy tale comes true because Esther is made queen. Listen to verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. This was an instant thing. I mean, I don't know how many women he'd seen before this, but when he met Esther, the contest was over with. He instantly put the crown on her head and said, she's the winner. And she became a queen in place of Vashti. He didn't even look at anybody else. And then the king gave another banquet. And this is known as Esther's banquet. A big celebration with the people and officials in Susa to celebrate the fact that he had another queen. I think the king was so thrilled. Imagine this, guys. The king was so thrilled about this that he canceled taxes for a day. I mean, that's how thrilled he was. We're going to celebrate my new queen. We won't even charge taxes. You're exempt for this day. So that's the kind of thing that was going on here. And Esther becomes the queen. The unlikely orphan becomes the queen of the realm. It's a fun story. What do we do with it? What kind of lessons can come from that story? Well, I had so much out of this that I realized I was going to be up here 2 hours. And so I decided, this is where we came up with an extra week. I decided we better focus on one thing this week and look at the other things next week. So next week we're going to walk back through the same passage rather quickly and see some more lessons from it. But for this week, here's what I think we need to think about. God put Esther in a special place at a special time. And she was able to join in his work and accomplish his purposes. God put Esther in a special place at a special time so she could join in his work and accomplish his purposes. God is always faithful to accomplish his kingdom purposes. Nobody can defeat him. He's always faithful to accomplish his purposes. But he uses people like you and me and like Esther to do that. And he will put the people that he wants in the places he wants them to be so that they can accomplish those purposes. And that's exactly what is happening here. He is behind the scene doing everything to bring her to that position. And we will see how Esther was put in that position for a very specific reason. The most famous verse in this book is, "For such a time as this, you're here." And in a few weeks, we're going to look at that passage, why that she came in to this position. But for today, I think we need to realize that every subject of God's kingdom is put in a place where they can have eternal significance. It's not just royalty. It's not just wealthy people. It's not just the really successful in the world people. It's every subject of God's kingdom. Everyone who trusts in Jesus Christ as Savior, God puts in the place he wants them to be. The New Testament says God has placed the members of the body, each one of them just as he desired. God takes every one of us who trust in Jesus Christ and puts us where he wants us to be, just like he did for Esther. The key phrase of this whole scene is that dramatic scene change where it says, "There was a Jew in Susa." That's where the whole story changes. That is the key phrase, because God had put Mordecai and Esther right where he wanted them so he could accomplish what he was going to accomplish. Isn't that just like God? Take a forgotten orphan and turn her into a queen of the realm. Isn't that just like God to do that? He is sovereign over the circumstances of her life, and he is sovereign over every circumstance of your life and of my life. And he moves our marbles as he desires, and sometimes those shuffle in ways that are uncomfortable. But he moves those marbles in order for us to be where he wants us to be. God uses all kinds of things to place people where he wants them. Again, Kathy and I were reading Psalm 105 in our prayer time this week and praying through that psalm, and it's the one we used for our call to worship. But it goes on to say how faithful God is to his promises and his purposes. And in about a third the way through that long psalm, it says this. It says, when he summoned a famine on the land, it's talking about God, when he summoned a famine on the land and he broke all the supply of bread, he had already sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt in fetters. His neck was put in a collar of iron until what he had said came to pass. And the word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the peoples set him free and made him lord over his whole house and all his possessions. If you don't know the story of Joseph, go back to the last about 15 chapters of Genesis and read it. It's probably the second most exciting plot story with twists in the Bible, and has a lot of parallels with this one, a great story. But there was going to be a famine, but God had already put the right man in the right place. But you know what he used to get him there? His brother sold him into slavery. He was falsely accused of rape. He was thrown into a dungeon. And then, strangely enough, some of Pharaoh's servants were thrown into that same dungeon. Some of his advisors, not servants, were thrown into that same dungeon. As they got to know Joseph, he helped them, and they remembered Joseph and passed that on to Pharaoh. And Joseph eventually became second in command in the whole kingdom of Egypt. But it went through some rough things to get there, and Psalm 105 reminds us of that. Not only, it says God sent a man ahead of them. You know what Joseph said? Later in life, when he was reconnected with his brothers, they were afraid Joseph was going to do something to them because he was such a powerful person at that point. Here's what he said. You sold me into slavery. You meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. God sent a man ahead because he needed that man in that place. Psalm 105 goes on to talk about Moses. Moses, perfectly trained, as we learned in that series a year ago, going through his life, perfectly trained for the job that God had him. But here's what it took. He survived genocide as a baby. He was adopted into the royal family in Egypt. He was falsely accused of murder, and he was banished into the wilderness, and he was out there in the middle of nowhere for 40 years. And that's what God used to prepare Moses. And yet there was Moses there when God needed him. God uses all kinds of people. It's not just, I'd say Joseph and Moses. When I was practicing this morning, I said Joseph and Moseph, and I couldn't get it right. So Joseph and Moses, it's not just them. Think about Saul of Tarsus, perfectly trained for the job that God wanted him to do. The Apostle Paul. He was a Roman citizen. And yet, he was trained in the best school of Jewish people. And he had both sides of that equation. Think about Rahab, a prostitute who heard the stories of God and believed in him. Think about, how about an unnamed Jewish slave girl, taken captive by the Syrian army, became a servant of the wife of the general Nahum. She told Nahum about their prophets and their God, and it changed his life. Think about David, a shepherd boy that God anointed king over the whole nation. And we could go on and on. All of the prophets were people God moved into place. All of the judges. Did a series in Judges a couple of years ago that really changed my life and perspective to see the kinds of weird people God puts in leadership. And we could go on Ruth and Boaz and more and more and more. Story after story in the Bible where God shuffled marbles in such a way that he had people where he wanted them to accomplish the work that he wanted them to accomplish. That is God at work in our lives, putting his people in the right place at the right time for what he desires of them. And by the way, God can use all kinds of things for that. Think about some of the things in this story. We're going to look at these in more detail next week. But just quickly think about some of these things. God uses ordinary circumstances, like a spat between a king and a queen, or a young orphan being adopted by her older cousin. He uses surprising things, like an orphan chosen to be in a beauty pageant. He uses uncomfortable things. She was an orphan. She lost her parents. But also, we'll talk about this more next week, she was taken for this pageant. This wasn't a choice. She was taken forcibly to be in this pageant. And stressful things. A year of beauty treatments with all these other petty women. Or just a few hours to please the king. Stressful things. And even God can use abusive things. This wasn't just a beauty pageant. They all had to spend a night with the king. And it wasn't in conversation. This is an abusive kind of situation. You know, these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of marvels that God moves that shift our lives. And yet, just like with Esther, they work in dramatic ways to put us where God wants us to be. Again, we'll talk more about that, about these kinds of situations next week. But for this week, here's what I want you to think about. God made you with a purpose. God made you with a purpose. And he has you in the place that you're in because he has eternal, significant things for you to do. And I think that is profound enough that that's all we need to talk about today, just that one point. Just like Moses, just like Joseph, just like Esther, God shuffled the marbles in their lives to be where he wants them to be. And that's what he does with us. And if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you are where you are because God has a purpose for you. Everything that has happened in your life, even those uncomfortable things, have happened because God wants you where you are now. Because he has something eternally significant for you to do. He knows every detail of your past. He has a plan for those details, and you can trust him in that.